Are you looking to learn how to TIG weld aluminum? This is the smartest and most strategic tutorial that you're gonna find on YouTube. We're gonna break this challenge into 3 stages. Hour number 1, hour number 2, and hour number 3. That's right, can you learn these important lessons in 3 hours or less? You are gonna have such a better understanding of what to get started with after this lesson here. But only if you follow every step in this lesson perfectly. You'll see why in a bit here. Hour 1, TikTok, let's get going. All right, this is gonna be the most important way to get started here. We're gonna set up your machine, torch and gas, and make sure everything's running correctly. You are gonna need a TIG welding machine with AC capability or alternating current. Alternating current is what is necessary to deal with the aluminum oxide that you have to deal with when you're welding it. Without alternating current, unfortunately, welding aluminum is not really possible. This can be a transformer type machine, this can be an inverter type machine, doesn't matter. If it has AC or alternating current, you are good to go. The machine will be set up with your ground attached to the table. You're gonna wanna clamp it relatively close to your working area. And the other terminal on your machine is going to be the torch lead. And obviously your machine's gonna be hooked up to a gas cylinder as well. We'll go over gas settings in a second here, hang on for that. Now, as far as machine settings go, what you want to do first is essentially set up your amperage or the amount of heat that you are going to be welding with. Typically, I set this up for just a little bit more than I know I will actually need. I then go ahead and I dictate this by using a foot pedal as I'm working with each exercise. And with each exercise we do here, the amperage range that you're going to use is going to be a little bit different from one another. So I'll display the amperage as we go through each exercise. Be sure to take note and pay attention to that detail as we go into each exercise here. Now, everything you're seeing today is basically a very quick version of what I offer on my website with my classes. My classes are free, you can register for them right now, but for YouTube, quickly today, check this out. Next up for aluminum, I'm gonna set my balance. Typically, I tend to set my balance somewhere around 75% DCEN and approximately 25% DCEP. This is a bit of a deep, subjective topic that I won't get into right here. Again, if you wanna go deeper with this subject, hit the free class on my website. But for what I'm gonna set it right here, 75-25, this is gonna be a great all-around setting for a majority of machines out there. And this is gonna do great for the type of welding exercises and the material that we're gonna use in this exercise here. Now, adjusting your frequency is something that typically you can only do if you are using an inverter type machine. You unfortunately cannot adjust this if you're using a transformer type machine. If you have an inverter type machine, typically I'll set this for somewhere around 120 Hertz. The other very important setting, regardless of what type of machine that you are using, is going to be post flow. This is going to determine the amount of gas that runs for a specific amount of time after you finish each weld. This is very important. If the tungsten is glowing red hot, it still needs to be thoroughly covered with a supply of gas. I typically set mine for around 6 to 8 seconds. When the post flow cycle is finished, you should see a tungsten that is shiny and reflective. You do not want to see anything gray or oxidized like this example here. We do not want this. And that is it. How about that? Let's keep the settings super simple. The subject of thoroughly understanding and breaking down the settings, especially ones that you may have specifically on the machine you are using. Again, if you want to learn more, hit the free class on my website. Now, if you are using a thumb trigger with your setup, you're going to want to set your up slope and your down slope for approximately 2 seconds. This will be a little different for everybody, but that's a great ballpark. But like I said, we are using the foot pedal here today, so the settings of upslope or downslope are not needed with this setup. Okay, now to cover the torch. There are so many options as far as different torch setups and different torch parts that you could be using. Again, if you want to really break down what you got, the classes on my website will help you out with this. But there's fundamentals that apply to everything no matter what setup you are using. Make sure that your stuff is assembled correctly. The collet body needs to be done up tightly and securely. We do not want this loosening off as you are welding. This is a really bad thing. However, we don't want to do it up too tight either. If you do it up too tight, it will heat up, cool down, constant expansion and contraction from heat. This can actually cause the threads in the torch to seize completely. Use a pair of welding pliers like this and make sure it is done up just a little bit more than finger tight. Now, very importantly, the cup needs to make sure that it seals completely to the adapter. There's many different options as far as adapters that you may have access to. Just make sure that this seal is done up tightly and the pieces fit together correctly. The cup that I am using is going to be a number 5 cup. Depending on what type of outer collet body you are using, whether it is a gas diffuser or a gas lens, Just make sure that you use the correct corresponding inner collet sleeve. Make sure that you put it in the torch correctly. Do not put it in backwards. This is very common. Again, if you tighten this up and it's in backwards, this can seize very easily. Use whatever back cap is appropriate for the length of tungsten that you are using. And last, we'll put the tungsten in. Typically for what I'm doing for aluminum, I'm going to be using 2% lanthanated. It's going to be tapered and prepared with a slight ball on the end of it. I will typically use either this, a serrated tungsten, or a laser tungsten from CK Worldwide. Zirconiated tungstens also work really well with transformer type machines. I use them all the time with great success with transformers back in the day. Again, putting together your torch as well as preparing your tungsten is a subjective topic that we could literally talk about for hours. The class on my website goes into it further. Now, I typically run a stick out with my tungsten that is equal to the measurement of my cup opening. For example, if the cup opening that I'm using is approximately 1/4 of an inch or 6.4 millimeters, the stick out will not exceed 1/4 of an inch or 6.4 millimeters. Make sure that the tungsten is done up tightly and securely, and there we go. Okay, onto our gas now. What I am using here is 100% argon. There's mixes out there of 75% argon, 22.5% something else, and a 2.5% sprinkling of some other magic super gas. We are practicing and we're learning here, people. Nothing crazy. Keep it simple. Argon keeps the puddle nice and clean, keeps everything welding nice and stable. 100% argon is all you're going to be needing. Don't complicate things. Keep it simple. For aluminum, with the cup size that I'm using, I'm going to set this to about 15 CFH. And again, this changes pretty drastically depending on what size cup you're using and the amount of amperage that you are welding with. But for what we're doing here, this should be a great place to start. So here we go. We've got our machine set up properly. We've got our torch put together correctly. We've got the gas running to an appropriate amount of the type of gear that we're using here. Now, how do we ensure that we are running correctly? You're about to see the most simple and effective thing that I teach in my program right here. You ready? This exercise here is called the dry arc. A lot of people think this one is boring, so they usually skip over it, but this is extremely important to make sure that we got everything done up properly so far. Let's go. This is the plate material I'm going to be using here, and this is what I'm going to use for all the exercises here in this episode. What I'm doing is I am just arcing up on the plate. I'm making sure that I don't arc on too fast, and once I get a puddle going, I'm running along carefully. As we are traveling along, we want to make sure that we are maintaining this travel angle here, and we want to stay somewhere around 90 degrees with our torch angle across the welding path here. When we form the puddle, we want to form a puddle that is nice and controlled, but we want to make sure that we wait for it to form completely at the start before moving. Once you are moving, you want to keep a consistent distance from your workpiece. I call this the standoff distance. Other people also call it arc length, arc distance. There's other names for it too, but I refer to it as standoff distance. We want this distance to be about equal to the diameter of your tungsten. As we are traveling, we want to keep this consistent. We don't want to see this distance drift away from the workpiece as we start to travel. This is what's going to help you to keep your results clean and consistent. In my full program, we actually follow a really intricate layout with this exercise, and we learn to do some really important tricks with this simple fundamental exercise right here. It teaches you so much about controlling the heat and thoroughly understanding what is going on here. But essentially for what we're doing here today, we want to make sure that everything that we've set up is running clean and properly. As you finish, back off the pedal or down slope nice and slowly. Arc off nice and controlled. Let's check it out. We want to make sure that the start has established thoroughly and completely before moving. We want the width and size of it to be the same from all the way at the beginning to the end. Comparing the width at the beginning of our pass. Did it stay consistent to the width at the end of the pass? At this point here, if you are seeing results that look dirty or inconsistent, here is where I'm going to introduce you to our first checkpoint. Yes, that's right. The point that we are at here right now is a checkpoint. So what this means is if we see any results that do not look the way that you are expecting, the solution is with everything that we've covered so far. It's going to be either something to do with our setup and assembly of our gear or the tips with the welding stuff that we have been over so far. This could be material contamination, contamination from insufficient gas supply, a torch that perhaps has a loose part, machine setup that's not set up correctly, or a problem with the details of welding like we've been over so far. Whatever it is something to do with what we have covered already. If you're having problems, go back to this timestamp and review the stuff we've been over so far. And then again, returning to this exercise of the dry arc is going to tell you if you've completed everything we need to before moving on from this checkpoint. So if everything is looking good after the passes that we've done so far, let's start working on hour number 2 here. It's time to add the next variable of what's going to get us into the real deal stuff here. And arguably the step that we are at here is the most important part of this entire lesson. We are going to start working with the filler material. You can see the alloy and diameter of the filler material that I prefer using here. I find that this is the most forgiving type of filler material that you can work with when you are learning. Different alloys can give off a different finish that can sometimes be a little bit unreliable to understand what's going on. Remember, we want to see if things are looking nice and clean and on track for what we've learned so far. Some different alloys of filler material can also be a little bit erratic, not quite as smooth, especially when you're adding the filler material to the puddle. Again, working with the filler material and introducing it to your work, this is a really big subject that we cover pretty extensively in my classes online. But essentially this alloy and this diameter is what I recommend right here. Now, when you start adding filler material to the mix of what we've practiced so far, very importantly, make sure that you are comfortable with this before you start to use it. A lot of people pick it up for the first time and they say, oh yeah, this feels a little bit awkward. Whatever, let's go for it. This is not what you want to do. Trust me, this will save you time in the long run. Starting to work with this stuff before you're extremely comfortable or really understand how to work with it, this is going to create some really big bad habits that you're going to have to deal with later. Better to take care of it at this stage here. Learn to feed the filler material with your fingers and advance from a stationary position. Do not hold with a static grip and dab. What's going to happen is your hand is going to get closer to the welding area. The hand is going to get in your way. You're not going to be able to see as clearly, or in some cases you can even burn your fingertips. Make sure that when you are feeding, do not feed from the side like this. We want to feed in line with the pass direction. Now, because you've taken the time to practice this quite a bit, and you're feeding in line and feeding comfortably with your fingers now, right? You are going to have a way easier time of feeding the filler material to the sweet spot of the puddle. As we are welding, we want to keep a tight standoff distance like we talked about, and you are going to feed to this area right here. This is going to be halfway from the leading edge of the puddle and the center of the puddle. Anywhere to either side of this, you're going to have problems with the filler material blowing off, or you're going to have problems with it sticking or leaving filler drag on the edge of the puddle like this. When you get a good clean dab of the filler material into your puddle, the tip of your filler rod is going to look like this. It's going to have a nice little clean point. It's not going to have some deflated balloon looking thing like this here. A clean point like this means you got the filler material in and out nice and smooth. Now, as you are traveling, feeding the filler material, maintain the angles that we talked about earlier. We want to keep the standoff distance in nice and consistent as well. As we start, we want to make sure the first filler dab is filling up nicely. When you add filler material, we want to see the reinforcement build up. We do not want quick dabs that do not add any reinforcement like this. However, we do not want to see too much reinforcement that we lose the smooth transition between the filler material and the base material. You're going to see edges that do not transition nice and smooth like this here. Once your first puddle looks great, you can go ahead and you can start moving now. What I do is I move in a stepping pattern like this. I'm going to move, dab, wait, move, dab, wait, and repeat this. Now when I'm stepping, I want to make sure that I don't step too far apart. Stepping too far apart exposes the center of each step, and it's going to cause the line on the edge to go in and out. We want to keep things on the edge nice and straight like this here. I find the ideal distance for stepping is for each puddle to cover approximately 2/3 to 1/2 of the previous puddle each time you take a step. When you're welding, travel along as far as you're comfortable, and then we want to see how consistent you can keep this. We want to see a consistent width from start to finish with this one. We don't want any areas skinnier or wider than others. We want to keep the stepping distance consistent and correct. And we want adequate reinforcement from start to finish. Now in my program, what we do is we actually follow a really strategic layout on the practice material as we are practicing. In the program, this teaches us how to properly connect passes with good stop starts. It helps us to really understand how to properly maintain the details of width and consistency. But for getting going here, just run passes on your plate and fill up free space. Now again, stop. We are at a checkpoint. How are things looking with the work that you're doing here? It's fine if you're watching this video just taking notes and you haven't started practicing yet. The important thing is that when you do practice that you stop and really take note of where things are at these checkpoints. Do we see the results that we want? If not, it's all good. Just go back to the previous checkpoint. The timestamp is right here. Easy peasy, right? Try out the dry arc again. Make sure that everything is still dialed in. If that's looking good, then you can come back to this checkpoint here and try again. But if you go back to that dry arc exercise and you actually see that you are still having some problems, we may have some other problems that you may need to sort out. So go back to the previous checkpoint before that one. Do you see how important these checkpoints are? If things are looking really good at this point here, heck yeah, nice work. Give yourself a pat on the back. Let's move on. It is seriously really important to be honest with these checkpoints. This is how you're gonna get the most out of these steps that you're doing here. And again, with everything that we're doing, we're hurrying along here right now. In my program, we actually do over 5 actual different lessons before the point that we're at right now. Well, actually 6 or 7. I think there's actually more lessons specifically on adding filler material to the mix. See, we get way into detail in the program, but you get the idea. We have the textbook pages to follow along that really sink everything in as far as the checkpoints to follow. It's great reference material that you can check in with as you are practicing. They give you specific timestamps to different areas in the video lessons to follow. It's all about working in a strategic progression to make sure that we get the most out of each stage before we move on. Go get that program in the description below. But for now, let's party on. Next section here. You are about to do your first actual welding joint. Well done. Okay, this one is pivotal. We are gonna actually weld our first real welding joint here. Welcome to hour number 3. This is going to be the butt joint exercise. We're gonna join 2 separate pieces of practice material together, and we're gonna perform a weld along the edge of the plates like this right here. Now, the layout of everything that we've done so far in this lesson is divided into 3 separate hours, but do not feel obligated or pressured to rush this at all. Some people will absolutely make it through this lesson plan in a shorter amount of time, and some prefer to take a little longer, get the most out of each exercise, and have no pressure. Whatever you want to do, take your time, it's all good. You can watch this lesson or the classes on my website at any time you want. Now, for putting this joint together and other joints that we're going to go over in the program, there is a very strategic process that we follow with tacking. We're going to make sure that we do it in a very certain and strategic way, but let's keep it simple here. Make sure that the tacking that you do is the exact size of the weld that you want to go over it. If you have big, dumb, stupid tacks that you have to travel over, it's going to make a big bump with the welding that has to travel over it, and it's going to mess up your consistency. However, if the tacking is too small, it can actually break during weldment, and the joint alignment can actually shift or pop open in the middle of a welding pass. That totally sucks. Leave some materials at the ends. A little bit of extra material is going to help to absorb some of the heat. And again, leaving this stuff alone with your welding is going to help to prevent the joint from popping open or shifting or changing alignment at all. Now, everything that we learned in the previous checkpoint to this one is going to come into play with this exercise here. Proper heat control, as well as adding the filler material correctly, maintaining proper angles of travel as we are moving along. However, now we are taking all of these things that we learned in the first 2 hours of this lesson, and we are applying it to welding on the edges of a couple pieces of plate to make an actual joint here. But you can see I'm maintaining all of the angles that we learned about earlier. A correct and consistent standoff distance with my travel. When you add filler material, we want to see the reinforcement build up. And the consistency of my filler material is going in very nicely. We can see that the results of this exercise here are pretty similar to when we started working with filler. The width is pretty good from start to finish. The consistency of the reinforcement and the edges look pretty good. And the consistency and distance of the stepping looks great as well. You can challenge yourself after you get comfortable with this one to try and get good penetration on the other side. But again, when you're first learning, just focus on the top side first. Don't worry about the penetration yet. We want the top side to look perfect. Once that looks good and consistent every time, then we can flip it over, start looking for results on the back side. Now, do you want to know the most insane thing at this point here? Check this out. The lesson and the point that we are at right now is usually where people start trying to learn how to TIG weld. When I actually went to welding school for proper education and certification, this was the first exercise that they gave us. Even though at that point when I went to school, I was relatively experienced with TIG welding, I was a little surprised that there was no building of actual fundamental and understanding of all the stuff that came before this point that we've been over so far. And there was no way to really build an understanding without proper checkpoints like I've laid out for you here. So basically, think of it like this. Look at everything that I've taught you up to this point here. You've got such a better understanding of machine and torch and gear setup, how to get going and troubleshoot problems with all of the checkpoints that I've laid out for you here. Again, take a look at them all right here. If you think that the strategy that I laid out in this episode here was helpful, do yourself a favor and jump into the classes on my website. Again, they are free. Now it's up to you to actually use this advice and get welding.